They called her just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce said in the hallway outside Cedar Creek Medical's trauma bay, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd spent 32 years building a reputation that seemed carved from bone and arrogance. She didn't hear it directly. She never did. But the hallway acoustics were good, and Katie Morrison had learned long ago to listen to what wasn't meant for her ears. He didn't know she was standing 3 feet away, hand steady on a crash cart, waiting for the next admission. He didn't know that the nursing degree on her wall at home was real, earned through 18 months of intensive study, credentials as legitimate as his own surgical fellowship. What Dr. Pierce didn't know was that Captain Katie Morrison had already spent 14 years, not in civilian hospitals, but in forward operating bases where the definition of triage came down to who could still be saved in the next 4 minutes. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that none of it mattered anymore, because 8 months ago, military intelligence had buried her under scrubs and competence at Cedar Creek to watch a man in a hospital bed 3 floors up, and every day she got closer to answers. Someone like Pierce reminded her why the military had taught her to blend in and disappear. The morning shift started at 6:47. Katie clocked in using the employee access code, 2847, and the electronic lock clicked open with the sound of 1,000 small choices made in advance. The hospital hallway smelled like someone had weaponized antiseptic and bleach, a chemical burn that lived in the back of your throat by hour 3. She'd worked in field hospitals where the smell of infection and diesel fuel mingled with blood and desperation, places where you learned to breathe through your mouth because your nose had no business filing complaints. This sterile, humming world of Cedar Creek Medical was supposed to be an easy cover. A place to move through without drawing attention. 8 months in, she'd learned that wasn't possible. Competence draws eyes. Steady hands draw questions. And Katie Morrison had hands that had held lives together in the dark, and those hands didn't shake. She wheeled the crash cart toward the elevators, her movements efficient, mechanical, the kind of motion that came from muscle memory so deep it didn't require thought. The scrubs fit loose enough to hide the outline of the compression vest she wore, the one that had been second nature for so long she forgot it was there until she showered. Her hair was pulled back with a black elastic, standard issue for hospital protocol, and her name tag read K. Morrison, RN, with the photo that had been taken 8 months ago, before she'd been reassigned. Her eyes in the photo looked tired. Most people's did. Nobody suspected tired. Tired was invisible. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor with a mechanical sigh. Neurology wing. Recovery. The hallway stretched toward room 314, and Katie's breathing didn't change, though her pulse quickened by exactly 8 beats per minute. Controlled. Manageable. She'd trained for this. Not for hospitals, for missions where maintaining composure meant the difference between coming home and a folded flag ceremony. Colonel James Davis lay in room 314 with his left leg elevated in traction and his right arm bound in a sling that probably felt like a reminder of failure. He was trying to read something on a tablet when Katie knocked twice on the doorframe and entered without waiting for permission. The doctors did that. So did the nurses who carried authority in their movements instead of their credentials. Morning rounds, she said. Her voice was soft, practice neutral. How's the pain? Colonel Davis looked at her, actually looked, the way only military people did, the way that suggested he saw the world in layers and was trying to figure out which one she occupied. 4. Down from 6 yesterday. Katie nodded and moved to the forepaw on his left hand. The line was clean, no signs of infiltration, no swelling. She adjusted the flow rate on the bag, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that came from a decade and a half of doing this under conditions that made a hospital look like a resort. The physical therapist will be here at 9. Your son's commanding officer called yesterday. I put the message on your chart. That wasn't true. Her son's commanding officer was lying in a hospital bed being monitored by his son's mother, who was pretending to be nursing staff while actually conducting an intelligence operation that had already claimed 2 lives in a training accident that everyone on active duty knew wasn't an accident at all. But small lies were part of the job, the kind that kept you invisible. Derek. Davis's eyes sharpened. Is he? Fine. Last I checked. Katie didn't tell him that she'd heard from Derek that morning, brief encrypted message, protocol clean, nothing that would draw attention. Derek didn't know his mother was here. Derek didn't know his mother was anything other than what she'd told him, a widowed woman who'd taken a nursing job to pay for his college fund. He didn't know that his father had died in Kandahar because someone had made a mistake, and his mother had spent the last 4 years proving it in every way except the ones that mattered. She checked his vitals. Blood pressure 138/84, elevated but not critical. Heart rate 72, steady. Oxygen saturation 98%. The numbers lived in her mind like a second language, a dialect that transcended the noise of hospitals and combat zones and the quiet spaces in between. She documented everything in the chart, her handwriting precise, unremarkable, the penmanship of someone who had nothing to hide. The door opened without a knock. Dr. Pierce entered the way he entered every room, as if the space had been waiting for his arrival and was grateful for the privilege. He was tall, lean in the way that came from expensive gym memberships and protein supplements, his surgical hands immaculate and probably never actually used in surgery anymore. His white coat bore the patches of a surgeon who'd published 43 papers and consulted for the military, which meant he knew enough to be dangerous and not enough to understand the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Captain Morrison, he said, though her rank wasn't on her badge and he knew her name was just Katie here. "How's our patient?" It was the way he said "our," as if the patient belonged to both of them, when in fact the patient belonged to whatever fever dream bureaucracy had decided that a decorated trauma surgeon deserved access to a hospital bed where a special operations officer recovered from an accident that wasn't. "Vital stable," Katie said. "Pain management improving. Physical therapy starting this morning." Dr. Pierce moved toward the chart with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he'd never wasted a movement in his life, which made him predictable. Predictable was useful. Katie stepped back, gave him space, assumed the posture of deference that came naturally when you'd spent enough time around people who actually held power. Her hands relaxed. Her shoulders rounded slightly. Her voice dropped by half a register. "Anything else you need from me, Doctor?" Pierce didn't answer immediately. He was reading the chart, his eyes moving with the speed of someone trained to process information quickly and retain it perfectly. His jaw was the kind of architecture that had probably broken hearts in medical school. He wore a wedding ring, platinum, expensive, and a watch that cost more than some surgeries he'd performed. "This is the officer who was in the Bagram incident," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir. 2 soldiers died in that training accident. Helicopter crash during a night insertion drill." Katie didn't correct him. Helicopter didn't crash. Helicopter was sabotaged, and the evidence was buried under 42 layers of bureaucratic silence, and one of the pilots was a sergeant named Mitchell Hayes who had 3 kids under 7 years old and a wife who'd already started collecting the life insurance policy. But Captain Katie Morrison, floor nurse at Cedar Creek Medical, wouldn't know any of that. She would just nod and adjust the 4 bag and pretend that competence was all she could offer. "That's what the reports say," she said quietly. Dr. Pierce turned from the chart and looked at her, really looked, the way people did when they were trying to solve a problem and the answer felt like it was somewhere just beyond their vision. "You're good at this," he said. "The patient management. The documentation. But you know, Katie, there's a difference between being good at nursing and being a real nurse. Credentials matter. Experience matters. Foundation matters." The words landed with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been practicing them, trying them out on mirrors or junior residents until they'd acquired the weight of actual truth. Katie's jaw tightened. Not visibly. Not enough to see. Just a small muscle contraction at the corner of her mouth that was probably invisible to everyone except someone trained to read micro-expressions. "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Pierce closed the chart with a snap that echoed in the small room. "Because I've reviewed your nursing background, and I have to say, 8 months in and you're already working like someone twice your experience. That's impressive. Or suspicious. Or both." The room felt smaller suddenly. The antiseptic smell grew heavier. Katie could hear the monitor beeping at Colonel Davis's bedside, steady, regular, normal, and she could hear the distant sound of a transport gurney rolling down the hall somewhere, the squeaking wheels a rhythm underneath his words like the tick of a clock. "I work hard," Katie said. "I care about the patients." "I'm sure you do." Pierce moved toward the door, and Katie felt the moment of pressure release slightly. He paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame. But hard work and competence without proper credentials is like flying without a flight plan. You might get where you're going. You might even land safely. But eventually, someone's going to look at your altitude and wonder how you got there without a clearance. Then he was gone, and the room felt larger again, and Katie Morrison stood perfectly still beside the four-stand, her hands resting on the bedrail with the kind of stillness that came from knowing exactly how much force was required to bend metal and exactly how much control it took not to. Colonel Davis watched her from the bed. "He doesn't like you," he said. "Doctors usually don't like floor nurses. That's not what this is." Davis shifted his position carefully, pain flickering across his face and then disappearing behind the same kind of composure Katie recognized because she wore it. "That's a man trying to figure out if he should be afraid of you." Katie looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, she wondered how much he actually knew, whether military intelligence had briefed him on her presence here, whether the surveillance was mutual and everyone was just pretending. But his expression told her nothing. Military people learned early that expressions were the first thing you controlled, the first thing you weaponized. "I should check on the other patients," Katie said. "Right." Davis turned back to his tablet. "Just so you know, Captain, the real captain, I mean, if you need backup with Pierce, there are people who would answer that phone call." Katie didn't respond. She simply left the room, pulled the door closed with a soft click, and walked down the hallway toward the elevators, her pace steady, her breathing controlled, her mind already recalibrating. Pierce was a problem now. Not a big one. Not yet. But the smallest problems were the ones that grew quietly in the dark until they became catastrophic. The next voice she heard wasn't human. It was the intercom crackling, "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. All available personnel. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. And that's when everything changed. Grand rounds at Cedar Creek Medical moved like a surgical procession, Dr. Pierce leading 20 residents through the orthopedic ward at 7:36 a.m., his white coat starched so precisely it could cut. Katie Morrison stood beside Colonel Davis's bed, preparing his morning medication with the kind of focused efficiency that comes from years of operating in austere environments where a single mistake means someone doesn't come home. Her hands moved with mechanical precision. Draw, check, administer. Document. Her patient's vital signs climbed steadily on the monitor beside her, BP stable at 118/72, heart rate steady at 64. Everything textbook. Everything perfect. That was the problem. Pierce slowed at the doorway, his gaze landing on Katie like a predator identifying weakness. He gestured to the residents clustered behind him, their notebooks already open, their eyes hungry for teaching moments. His voice carried that particular timbre of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, smooth as expensive leather, sharp as surgical steel. "Notice the textbook rigidity here," he announced, pointing not at Colonel Davis but at Katie herself, as though she were part of the anatomy lesson. "This is what happens when nurses mistake protocol for thinking. Captain Morrison here, oh, excuse me, just Nurse Morrison, demonstrates why experience simply cannot be replaced by enthusiasm." The residents shifted. One of them, a girl no more than 23, glanced at Katie with something like sympathy. Katie's jaw tightened, the only visible response, a single muscle flexing beneath her skin. But her hands didn't pause. The medication line went in with perfect technique. She secured the foreport, checked the flow, adjusted the infusion rate to exactly 15 milliliters per hour. Her documentation was immaculate. Every box filled with the precision of someone who understood that paperwork was accountability, that accountability was survival. Pierce continued, his voice a pleasant murmur designed to carry across the room. Textbook rigidity, residents, often masks inadequate foundational knowledge. When someone relies entirely on checklist medicine, they lose the capacity for critical synthesis. Notice how she never thinks, she simply executes. Which, I suppose, has its uses. But it is not leadership. It is not medicine. Katie stepped back from the bedside. She turned to Colonel Davis, a man whose file she'd memorized in ways that would make the intelligence community proud, a commanding officer who'd survived something at Bagram that shouldn't have survived, whose presence here under mysterious circumstances was precisely why she'd accepted this assignment. She smiled at him, a genuine expression that Pierce wouldn't have understood if he'd studied it for hours. "You're all set, sir," she said quietly. "Vitals are strong. Pain management should kick in within the hour. Call if you need anything." She walked past Pierce and his procession of residents without making eye contact, without flinching, without giving him the smallest satisfaction of knowing her professional execution had just been publicly dismantled in front of 20 people who would carry his assessment forward through the hospital's informal networks like gossip was diagnosis. The corridor fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical rhythm overhead. Her badge hung against her sternum, catching light with each step. By the time she reached the medication station, she'd filed his words into the same compartment where she stored the sounds of mortar fire and the weight of body armor at 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Professional noise. Irrelevant to the mission. 2 days later, Tuesday afternoon, the break room hummed with the quiet desperation of hospital staff trying to disappear for 10 minutes. The vending machine sat in the corner, its LED lights casting that particular sickly glow that made everything look slightly diseased. Katie approached it methodically, selecting black coffee from the second row. The machine always jammed on that one, which meant less chance of someone engaging her in conversation while she waited. She'd learned to engineer solitude. Pierce stood at the machine beside hers, loud talking to an intern with the kind of performed casualness that only happened when a man wanted to be overheard. His voice had that particular texture of someone conducting a masterclass on how to think like he did. "You know what's genuinely dangerous?" Pierce was saying, his shoulder angled to ensure maximum audience. "Nurses who think watching YouTube makes them combat medics. You let them spend enough time in a trauma case, and they start believing their own mythology. They begin thinking they can diagnose, strategize, make decisions above their pay grade." He paused, checking his own vending selection with meticulous care. "Pretty soon, they're overstepping. Making calls that should stay with credentialed physicians. And when administration finally figures out who's really running things, there's usually some kind of incident." Katie's coffee dropped into the retrieval slot with a plastic thud. She fed 2 crumpled dollar bills into the machine slot, watching them disappear into the mechanism. Her peripheral vision tracked Pierce's position without her eyes moving. She understood what he was doing. He was establishing narrative. He was planting seeds in a witness. He was creating the infrastructure of doubt that would eventually allow him to move faster. She lifted the coffee, the cup still warm against her palm. The steam rose in a slight plume. She turned and walked directly past him, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. No reaction. No recognition. No indication that she'd heard a single word he'd just spoken, which of course meant she'd heard all of it, analyzed it, catalogued it, and filed it away with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. What she didn't let him see was the calculation happening behind her composed exterior. Rumors were his move. Isolation was his strategy. He was still in stage 2, social attacks, trying to poison the professional well. He hadn't yet moved to weaponizing policy or making calls to his network. But he was gathering ammunition. And that meant her timeline was compressing. The next occurrence came outside the supply room on Friday morning, 9:23 a.m., exactly when Katie knew Pierce would be making his rounds through the med storage area. There was no accident to this timing. He was waiting, his posture casual but his eyes tracking her approach. When she reached for the supply room door, he positioned himself between her and it, his body language a physical manifestation of obstruction. "Morrison," he said, his voice dropping from public performance to something more intimate and therefore far more threatening. "I've been talking to administration about you. Your references are interesting. Or should I say, sparse? The nursing school references, the clinical background, there are some significant gaps. Katie stopped exactly 1 meter from him. Close enough to violate his preferred distance. Her hands remained at her sides, completely still. Her posture didn't shift. When she met his eyes, her gaze held the quality of someone looking at something transparent. "You've been talking to administration," she repeated, her voice pitched at conversational level, completely flat. A voice without texture or emotion. A voice that said this man was an object to be processed, not a threat to be feared. "That's correct," Pierce continued, his confidence seeming to grow at what he perceived as her concern. "Seems your background is somewhat shadowy. Which is fine. But if you keep overstepping your role, making decisions that are above your credentialing, I'll have security escort you out of Cedar Creek myself. Are we crystal clear on that?" She waited exactly 2 seconds. The supply room refrigerator hummed behind him. Somewhere down the corridor, an overhead page announced a patient transfer. The fluorescent lights above their heads buzzed their endless mechanical complaint. "Crystal, doctor," she said. The flatness in her voice wasn't fear or acquiescence. It was the kind of clarity that comes from understanding the exact dimensions of a threat and having already measured your response. When she took a step forward, Pierce actually moved backward, giving her access to the supply room door. She opened it without another word, retrieved what she needed, and walked past him to return to her patients. What Pierce didn't see was the shift happening at that exact moment. Katie's hands were steady, but they were no longer those of a floor nurse simply trying to survive a temporary assignment. They were the hands of someone whose cover was fraying at the edges, who'd just been informed that her professional history was being examined by people with administrative authority, and who now understood that her timeline had gone from measured to critical. The rumors had started reaching administration by the following week. Katie heard fragments of them through the hospital's informal intelligence network, the way nurses exchanged information in break rooms and supply closets, the way hospital gossip traveled at the speed of social threat. Pierce had apparently begun having quiet conversations with the chief of surgery about Katie's qualifications. He'd sent an email chain questioning her methodology and her tendency toward independent decision-making that exceeds floor nurse authority. He was doing what competent men did when they wanted to destroy someone. He wasn't shouting. He was systematizing. And that's when the real nightmare began. 3 weeks into Pierce's campaign, Katie received a summons to the hospital administrator's office. A formal request on official Cedar Creek Medical letterhead. The kind of thing that didn't leave room for interpretation. She walked to that office on the 4th floor knowing that her window was closing, that Colonel Davis was still hospitalized, that her mission wasn't complete, and that Dr. Pierce had just moved from social demolition to strategic warfare. She climbed the stairs thinking about the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, the only physical piece of her real identity she'd allowed herself to carry into this life. It sat against her ribs like a secret. Like a countdown. The administrator's assistant gestured her toward the office. Through the glass walls, Katie could see 3 people waiting. 2 she didn't recognize. One was Dr. Pierce, his white coat immaculate, his expression perfectly composed into something that looked almost like concern. Her mission had just entered its most dangerous phase. And she had no way to call for backup without exposing everything. The Tuesday afternoon came in without warning. One moment the waiting room was drowsy with the hum of fluorescent lights and afternoon television, and the next the glass doors exploded inward like a rifle shot had shattered them. The man was 6'5", maybe 280 pounds of muscle wrapped in a canvas tactical jacket, his face a mask of pure rage. He screamed words that cut through the room like shrapnel. "Where are they? The bastards who killed my brother at Bagram? I know he's here. Colonel Davis. I know he's here." The room went dead silent for 1 heartbeat. Then chaos. A mother grabbed her child and bolted toward the back stairwell. An elderly man in a waiting room chair scrambled sideways, nearly knocking over his stand. 2 patients stood up at the same time and collided. Nurses behind the reception desk dug for the alarm button, their fingers fumbling, their movements the kind of pure panic that comes when the body recognizes a predator. The intruder's hand came up. A hunting knife. The blade caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a weapon itself. Serrated. At least 8 inches. He brandished it the way someone who'd used one before knew exactly how. Everyone moved away from him. Everyone except Katie. She stood up from where she'd been charting near the waiting room entrance. No rush. No tremor in her shoulders. Her gait unchanged, the same measured walk she used between patient rooms, the same posture she'd maintained through 8 months of Pierce's systematic humiliation. She walked toward the screaming man with the knife the way someone walks toward a coffee machine. Not casual. Not afraid. Just inevitable, like gravity had decided which direction she was going. The intruder's eyes locked onto her. You. Nurse. Back. Now. Not happening, Katie said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. Flatter. You need to lower the knife. I'm going to burn this place down. Colonel Davis killed my brother. He killed Marcus. Marcus was my only family. The man's hand shook. Not fear. Grief transformed into rage. His knuckles went white around the knife handle. Katie took another step forward. The distance closed. 6 feet. 5 feet. The knife came up higher, the blade pointing at her chest. Her hand stayed at her sides. No defensive posture. No flinch. Your brother's name was Marcus, Katie said. Not a question. A statement that landed like she'd just pulled a file from a classified archive. Marcus Webb. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Assigned to a joint operation at Bagram. 14 days ago. The knife wavered. How do you know? 3 words came out of her mouth in Pashto. Words that belonged to her other life, words that had no business being spoken by a floor nurse in a Norfolk hospital. They weren't threats. They were acknowledgement. Recognition. The kind of language that only someone who had stood in the mountains of Helmand Province would know. The knife froze. The man's face went pale. Katie moved. Her hands went from at her sides to controlling both of his in less than a second, not a grab, but a precise clinical insertion at his elbow joint, her weight shifting into an angle that made fighting physics itself easier than fighting her. The knife clattered to the tile floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. She pivoted his shoulder, not roughly, using the kind of joint lock that Special Forces operators practiced thousands of times on sand at Fort Bragg. The man dropped to one knee because his shoulder told him it was the only option his body had left. No one moved. Even the nurses behind the desk had stopped breathing. Katie released him and stepped back. The man stayed on his knee, gasping like he'd been running for miles. Security was already moving, but slowly, uncertainly, as though they'd just watched someone disarm a landmine with her hands. Marcus Webb and Sergeant Thomas Halloway, Katie said, still standing over him, her voice level as a surgeon's. Both killed in the same operation. Same day. Both supposedly training accident deaths. Both buried with full honors because no one was asking the right questions. She looked at the security officers. He's not a threat now. He's a witness. And he just lost his only family to the same incident we're investigating. Colonel Davis sat in his wheelchair in the East Corridor, where he'd been wheeled by an orderly 5 minutes earlier for a PT session. He'd watched the entire scene unfold through the double doors connecting to the waiting room. His face was stone except for his eyes. Those went wide for just a fraction of a second when Katie spoke in Pashto, when she said those 3 words that meant "I am one of you." His hand pressed against the armrest so hard his knuckles went white. The intruder's name was James Webb. Marcus's brother. 28 years old. He'd been discharged from active duty 18 months earlier with a bad knee and a worse divorce. He'd spent the last 2 weeks drinking and calling every military hospital between Norfolk and DC asking questions about Marcus's death that nobody would answer. When he finally found out Colonel Davis was recovering at Cedar Creek Medical, something in him had snapped. Or maybe it had finally crystallized, the kind of clarity that comes when grief finds focus. Katie told the officers to cuff him gently. They did. By the time the Norfolk Police Department arrived, by the time statements were being taken and the knife was being photographed and tagged, Dr. Pierce had already moved. He was at the security desk, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. The shift supervisor heard fragments. "Gerald, it's David." "Yeah, that nurse I told you about? The one I flagged in the credentialing office." A pause. "She just engaged an armed intruder. Walked directly at a man with a hunting knife instead of following evacuation protocol. No self-preservation instinct. Classic indicator of deeper instability. I want her removed from duty pending investigation." By 3 p.m., Katie was in the administrator's office. The office smelled like leather furniture and the kind of air freshener that tried too hard to mask something underneath, fear, maybe, or the faint copper tang of institutions that dealt in rules. 2 HR representatives sat across from her, their folders open, their expressions careful and legal. One was named Donna. The other was a lawyer from the hospital's internal counsel, which meant the trajectory had already been decided. "Walk us through your decision-making," Donna said, pen poised. "When you saw the intruder enter the waiting room, what was your thought process?" Katie sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded. Her shoulders were back. "I assessed the situation." "That's not an explanation," the lawyer said. His name was Henderson. He had the kind of precision that came from a decade of depositions. "Were you trained to engage armed assailants?" Silence. "Ms. Morrison, I'm asking directly. Do you have formal training in disarming weapons?" Katie's jaw tightened. "Just barely." The lawyer caught it. "Special Forces training," he pressed. "Military background? Anything in your personnel file we need to know about?" Still nothing. "Your nursing school records show a 4-year gap between graduation and your enrollment at Cedar Creek. No employment history for that period. No explanation. And now you're performing combat techniques in a civilian setting. That raises concerns. Serious concerns." The door to the office was partially open. Through the gap, Katie could see Colonel Davis in his wheelchair in the hallway, watching. His jaw was clenched. His eyes tracked back to her like he was trying to communicate something across the distance, apology, maybe, or an acknowledgement of what had just been set in motion. "I acted according to my assessment of the threat level," Katie said flatly. "The intruder's attention was on me. That reduced risk to the other patients." By walking toward him, Donna said. "It wasn't a question. Every protocol recommends evacuation and allowing security to engage. You did the opposite. The outcome was secured," Katie said. "No patients injured. No staff injured. The threat was neutralized. The threat was neutralized by combat techniques you shouldn't possess," Henderson said. "Which brings us back to the gap in your employment history and the fact that your references from Seattle Memorial won't return our calls." He slid a folder across the desk. "We called them. Your listed supervisor, Dr. Patricia Learman, reportedly doesn't recall you working there. She never heard of you. That's a problem." Katie's hands didn't move. Her face didn't change. But somewhere in her chest, the carefully constructed life of Katie Morrison, floor nurse, quiet professional, 8 months of building trust and access, collapsed like a building under controlled demolition. "I need to know who trained you," Henderson continued. "And I need to know why your employment references are false. Because if they are, this conversation moves from HR into federal fraud territory." She stayed silent. She couldn't say Bagram. Couldn't say JSOC. Couldn't say that she'd been placed at Cedar Creek Medical by military intelligence to monitor an officer whose training accident looked less like accident and more like execution. Couldn't say that the intruder's brother was right, that Marcus Webb had been killed, not in a training accident, but in an operation connected to Colonel Davis that something or someone had covered up. couldn't say that her investigation had just evaporated in front of the security desk at 2:41 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, that whoever had orchestrated the Bagram deaths now knew they had less than 48 hours to disappear. "I have nothing further to say," Katie said. Her voice was still level, still controlled. But now it carried the weight of doors closing, of futures being redefined, of the careful engineering of a cover story that had just been dismantled by the first moment she'd let her training show. Henderson and Donna exchanged a look. The lawyer made a note. "We're putting you on immediate administrative leave pending investigation," Donna said. "You'll be contacted within 3 business days with our determination. Your badge and credentials are being suspended as of now. You're not to enter this facility without express authorization from my office. Security will escort you out." Katie stood. She didn't argue. She walked to the locker room in the basement where she'd kept her few belongings, a cracked ceramic mug, a dying succulent plant on the shelf, a photograph of her son Derek in his high school Letterman jacket that she'd allowed herself as her only personal item in this life. By 6:02 p.m., she was standing at the bus stop 3 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical, rain beginning to fall in the kind of steady, cold way that made the evening feel like a sentence being spoken by someone who didn't care if you were listening. The cardboard box was heavy. And somewhere inside the hospital, Dr. Pierce was making phone calls, activating his network, tightening the final knots around what he thought was a woman who'd overstepped. He had no idea what he'd just done. He had no idea who he'd just cornered. Dr. Pierce didn't wait for the dust to settle. He didn't wait for security to clear the waiting room or for the intruder to be loaded into a patrol car. He moved like a man possessed by a single purpose, vindication disguised as protocol enforcement. By 2:24 p.m., 32 minutes after Katie had disarmed the assailant with 3 words in Pashto and a joint lock that looked like muscle memory disguised as luck, Pierce sat in his office with his phone pressed to his ear and Gerald Hutchins, the hospital board president, on the line. "Gerald. It's Richard Pierce. We have a serious liability situation at Cedar Creek." His voice carried the tone of a man solving problems, not creating them. "One of our floor nurses engaged an armed intruder directly. Violently. In front of witnesses. Protocol explicitly states protocol staff should evacuate and call security. She did neither. She walked toward a man with a knife like she'd done it before." Hutchins made a sound, interest mixed with concern. Pierce could hear golf course ambience in the background. They'd played together at Kings Point Country Club for 11 years. Trust was currency. "I'm concerned about her judgment, her background check, potentially falsified credentials. The nursing school listed on her application. I need you to think about the precedent we set if we don't investigate. What if next time she's wrong? What if someone dies?" The words were shaped like concern. They tasted like poison. By 3:15 p.m., Pierce had placed 4 calls. The first 2 were to nurses who worked Katie's shift. He asked them about her qualifications, her decision-making, whether she seemed unusually competent in ways that might suggest she was operating outside her training. The third call went to her nursing school at the University of Virginia. He spoke with Dean Morrison in admissions, asking pointed questions about Katie's background check, her military service gap, whether anyone had flagged her for unusual tactical knowledge. "I'm just being thorough," Pierce said, voice smooth as winter ice. "She endangered patients today. I need to understand her actual qualifications." Dean Morrison, uncomfortable and obligating, confirmed that Katie's application had listed Army background but nothing in the medical space, no combat medicine designation, no trauma training beyond standard RN requirements. The fourth call went to the Virginia Board of Nursing. Pierce reported a potential safety concern involving a nurse who may have engaged in an unauthorized medical procedure or combat-adjacent activity without proper credentials or supervision. It wasn't a lie. It was just shaped like one. By 4:24 p.m., the gears were turning. Hutchins had sent an email to Human Resources flagging Katie's employment for immediate review pending investigation into safety protocol violations. The nursing board had opened a preliminary inquiry. Pierce's network, colleagues who respected him, administrators who valued his judgment, the ecosystem of professional relationships he'd spent decades cultivating had activated with the precision of a well-oiled system designed to protect institutional interests. What none of them understood was that Pierce wasn't protecting the hospital. He was protecting himself from a woman who'd become too competent to dismiss and too composed to break. Katie was called to the administrative office at 5:12 p.m. She walked in still wearing her scrubs, knowing exactly what was coming. Across the desk sat Patricia Okonkwo, the HR director, flanked by 2 hospital administrators. Their faces carried the heavy resignation of people executing an uncomfortable but necessary procedure. "Captain, Ms. Morrison," Patricia began, then caught herself. "Your actions during today's security incident have raised serious concerns about your judgment and adherence to protocol. Can you explain why you approached an armed assailant instead of evacuating and calling security?" Katie's jaw was tight enough to cut glass. She sat down slowly, measured. The fluorescent lights hummed like insects caught in a trap. Her hands, scarred from things these people would never understand, rested flat on the table. She didn't tremble. She didn't explain. She didn't offer the truth because the truth would end everything: the investigation, the mission, the 8 months of careful positioning around Colonel Davis's recovery. "I have nothing to say," she said, voice quiet as a loaded weapon. Patricia exchanged glances with the administrators. Silence stretched like a rubber band pulled to its limit. In that silence, Katie's refusal to explain became her guilt. In that silence, protocol mattered more than outcome. In that silence, a woman who'd spent 8 months in perfect undercover composure was being destroyed by the one thing she couldn't reveal: who she actually was. "Given the circumstances," Patricia said quietly, "and your unwillingness to provide a professional explanation for actions that violated multiple safety protocols, we have no choice but to recommend immediate termination. Your final paycheck will be processed within 5 business days." Katie stood. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply walked to the employee lockers, removed her faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the only piece of her real identity she'd allowed herself to carry, and held it in her palm for exactly 3 seconds before tucking it back where it belonged. Against her chest. Over her heart. Concealed. The investigation into Colonel Davis's suspicious training accident at Bagram would stall now. The 2 soldiers who died alongside him would remain footnotes in classified reports. Whoever had orchestrated the operation would feel the investigation collapse and would pack carefully, disappear carefully, leave no forwarding address. Mission failure wasn't a statistic. It was a weight that didn't have a name. By 7:04 p.m., Katie stood at a bus stop on Ocean View Avenue, cardboard box balanced on her hip. The rain hammered the pavement like the spray from a Black Hawk rotor wash, and she didn't adjust her grip despite the water soaking through the bottom of the box. Inside was a cracked mug with a faded Army Medical Corps logo, a gift from her husband before Kandahar took him. Inside was a succulent she'd bought in June and never watered enough, its leaves dropping like surrender. Inside was a photograph of Derek in dress uniform, taken at his drop ceremony last spring. The only family she had left. Cars passed. Headlights reflected in the puddles and then moved on. None of them stopped. Her phone buzzed at 7:16 p.m. A message from her intelligence handler, a number she'd memorized 8 months ago, a voice she'd heard twice in encrypted calls: extraction compromised. Davis investigation suspended. RTB for reassignment. Return to base. The word sounded like defeat. She didn't board the bus when it arrived. She watched it pull away, taillights disappearing into the rain, and she remained at the stop, cardboard box heavy with things that no longer fit. At home in her silent apartment, she sat at the kitchen table still in wet scrubs. The succulent had dropped another leaf. Derek's photo stared at nothing. For the first time in 8 months, her hand shook, not from old shrapnel embedded in muscle memory, but from the weight of carrying secrets alone. She didn't cry. Her chest was too tight for crying. She just sat in the dark, jaw clenched, while the rain continued against the window like artillery in a distant war. Pierce celebrated that evening in his office with a glass of scotch purchased in 2003. He'd won. He'd seen something dangerous beneath her competence and he'd moved against it with surgical precision. He told his reflection that he'd protected Cedar Creek Medical from a liability. He didn't know that the woman he destroyed was the only thing standing between Colonel Davis and the people who'd tried to kill him. He didn't know that the investigation she'd been conducting under cover of a floor nurse's badge had just disappeared. He didn't know that in 42 hours, everything he'd believed about winning was going to collapse. Derek Morrison walked through the Cedar Creek Medical lobby at 7:38 a.m., still wearing his high school letterman jacket, carrying something that made nurses stop charting. A shadow box. Polished wood. Glass front. Inside it, medals arranged in precise rows. Silver. Gold. Ribbon bands in blues and crimsons. He didn't know what he was carrying yet. Not really. He'd found it in his mother's closet at 11 p.m. the night before, packed in a moving box underneath winter clothes she never wore, underneath a photograph of a man in dress uniform who died in Kandahar when Derek was 4. His father. He'd opened the shadow box in the dark and felt something shift in his chest, recognition without understanding. These weren't his medals. They couldn't be. His mom was a nurse. His mom pushed a med cart and wore compression socks and came home smelling like antiseptic and rain. But the name engraved on the frame backing said otherwise. Now he stood in the waiting room, 14 people scattered across plastic chairs, a receptionist typing intake forms, and Derek's voice cut through the morning fluorescent hum like a siren nobody expected. "Mom, they need to see these." He didn't whisper. He didn't ask permission. He held the shadow box at chest height, and the room did what rooms do when truth walks in unannounced. It stopped. Colonel James Davis, positioned in his wheelchair by the visitor check-in desk waiting for Katie's shift to start, lifted his head. His eyes moved to Derek. Then to the shadow box. Then to the medals inside. His jaw tightened. Closed. Opened again. He whispered one word, not a name, not a question, just a call sign. Valkyrie. A Marine veteran in a surgical mask, sitting 3 chairs down from Davis, heard it. He heard the weight in that single word. He stood. The shadow box was close enough now that he could read the engraving. His hands trembled as he spoke the citation aloud, his voice barely steady. Captain Katie Morrison. For extraordinary valor during a 14-hour combat rescue operation in Helmand Province. Single-handed extraction of 8 wounded personnel under sustained fire. Direct action that prevented loss of life. Presented by the Secretary of Defense. Silver Star. The words hung in the lobby like smoke. Derek didn't move. The shadow box stayed at chest height. The Marine veteran kept reading, his voice stronger now, anger mixing with something like reverence. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Commendation with V device. Bronze Star with oak leaf cluster. Combat Action Ribbon. A doctor in a white coat walking past the lobby stopped. Then a resident. Then a nursing supervisor. By the time a visiting general, in town consulting on trauma protocols, came down from the 3rd floor following the sudden silence, 12 people were standing in a waiting room nobody could turn away from. The general saw the shadow box first. Then the medals. Then the engraving. He read the rank. Captain. He read the name. Morrison. He'd attended military medical briefings. He knew the Valkyrie rescue operation, had it briefed to him by Joint Task Force commanders in 2012. 14 hours. 8 personnel extracted. 1 field thoracotomy performed with a combat knife and a prayer. 1 nurse who shouldn't have survived but did. 1 nurse who came back broken in ways that wouldn't show on X-rays, ways that made her walk toward armed intruders instead of away. The general's posture changed. His shoulders squared. His chin lifted. He came to rigid attention, not slowly, not gradually, one fluid motion like his spine had suddenly remembered all its training. His right hand rose. His fist came to his chest. A salute that meant everything. That meant honor. That meant this room was standing in the presence of someone who had given blood on foreign soil and asked for nothing. That's when Dr. Pierce pushed through the crowd. His surgical mask dangled around his neck. His white coat was crisp, unstained, bearing the arrogance of 23 years of unopposed authority. He pushed past the Marine veteran. Pushed past the receptionist. His voice came out loud and territorial and small. What circus is happening in my hospital? Security, clear this lobby. This is not a daycare. He didn't see the medals yet. Didn't understand the salute. Didn't register that Derek Morrison held his mother's entire hidden identity in a frame made of wood and glass and truth. But he saw Derek's Letterman jacket. Saw the kid's age. Made a calculation that said this was a teenager disrupting his morning rounds, and he was about to correct that problem the way he corrected all problems, with institutional authority and the implicit threat of status. The room reversed. It happened like a door opening in the wrong direction, like gravity flipping. The same people who'd avoided Katie's eyes in hallways, who'd stood silent when Pierce mocked her, who'd laughed at his jokes about nurses and YouTube and combat medics, those people turned. Not slowly. Not tentatively. They turned like prey animals recognizing a predator, except their focus wasn't on fear. It was on him. The visiting general stepped forward. His posture didn't soften. That's Captain Morrison's son, Dr. Pierce. Those are Captain Morrison's medals. That salute is hers. You're done. The Marine veteran's voice was quieter but harder. You spent months humiliating her. In front of patients. In front of staff. You called her incompetent. You called her a fraud. She's a decorated combat veteran and you screamed at her like she was an intern who filed the wrong paperwork. Someone's phone came up. The person holding it, a young IT tech waiting for a blood draw, already had the camera rolling. By the time Pierce realized it, by the time his face went red and his voice climbed into registers that sounded like panic, the footage was being uploaded. He screamed. That was the worst part for him later, not the defeat, but that he screamed. He screamed about security and liability and protocol violations. He screamed about who did this teenager think he was. He screamed about how this was a hospital, not a recruitment station, and if people couldn't follow basic institutional guidelines, they could get out of his facility. He screamed while a 17-year-old held his mother's silver star at chest height and a general stood in dress uniform saluting in the lobby of Cedar Creek Medical. The footage went viral by noon. By 3:38 p.m., Dr. Richard Caldwell, retired Navy surgeon, medical school mentor to Pierce 20 years ago, the man who'd written Pierce's residency recommendation back when Pierce was still young enough to maybe become the doctor he'd promised to be, saw the video on his grandson's phone. Caldwell watched it once. Watched it again. Watched it a third time, stopping on the frame where Pierce screamed and Derek held the shadow box steady. Then Caldwell made a phone call. "Gerald, it's Richard Caldwell." "Yeah, the one who trained Pierce. I'm calling to make a formal statement." His voice was the kind of calm that comes from having made harder decisions in operating rooms. "That's my former student screaming at Captain Morrison's son. That's the Valkyrie rescue operation? Gerald, I want it on record with the board, I disown any association with Dr. Pierce's conduct. If he claims my mentorship, you tell him I'm ashamed I taught him anything. He's a disgrace to the uniform he never wore and the oath he broke every day." The board convened an emergency ethics review by Thursday morning. Pierce was placed on administrative leave by Thursday afternoon. His surgical privileges were suspended pending investigation. His malpractice insurance company was already calculating the skyrocket in premiums. Colleagues who'd competed for his approval 6 months ago suddenly couldn't meet his eyes in hallways. His wife saw the video. His daughter saw the comments. His own father, a retired federal judge, saw the footage and didn't call. By Friday, the hospital's medical director delivered the verdict in a closed conference room where Pierce sat alone: immediate termination, with cause. No severance. No consultant contract. No pathway back. Just termination papers and a future that had become significantly smaller. Pierce cleaned out his office that night, alone. Awards came off the walls. Diplomas came off shelves. Everything that said Dr. Pierce went into boxes, and cleaning staff pretended not to notice. The hospital offered Katie full reinstatement with back pay and a formal apology. She declined the position of floor nurse. She had a different answer in mind. 6 months later, Katie Morrison stood in her new office, Director of Emergency Preparedness, Cedar Creek Medical, reviewing active shooter protocols with security staff. The walls were painted a shade of grey that didn't scream authority, didn't demand anything. Just presence. On her wall hung 2 items. First, the faded unit patch, now framed. The one sewn inside the jacket lining for 8 months, carried like a secret heartbeat. Second, a photograph of Derek in dress uniform, pinning captain's bars onto her shoulder at her official commissioning ceremony. Both frames were modest. Both commanded the room. Through her office window, Katie watched the loading dock. Movement near the supply van. Dr. Pierce appeared in a company polo shirt, Medisupply solution stitched in red thread, and khaki pants that didn't fit right. No white coat. No stethoscope. No residents following him around. He loaded boxes of latex gloves and surgical masks into the van with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times now. This was his career now, medical supply delivery, the only medical work he could find after the ethics violations, after the board's findings, after every hospital in Norfolk quietly blacklisted his applications. He glanced up at the building once. His eyes moved across the windows without seeing anything in particular. Then he closed the van door and drove away. That afternoon, Colonel James Davis visited Katie's office in dress uniform, his wheelchair pushed by a junior officer who saluted at the door before returning to the hallway. Davis closed the door behind him. The investigation closed, he told her, his voice measured and official. 3 officers implicated in the Bagram incident. Court-martial proceedings begin in 30 days. Your work, your cover, it mattered. Without your documentation, we'd have no case. Katie nodded. The intruder's brother. Get his answers now. Justice, not just condolences. Davis paused. And Katie, welcome back. We need more like you. Derek stopped by after school, still in his Letterman jacket, carrying college brochures that fanned out in his hands like evidence. He was holding 3 of them close, 2 pre-med programs, 1 military academy. Pre-med or military, he asked. I need to know. Katie smiled, the first real smile in months, the kind that reaches the eyes and doesn't leave immediately. Your choice. Just remember, true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. That night, Katie drove past the bus stop where she'd stood in the rain with that cardboard box. Her dead succulent, the one from the night she was fired, leaves brittle as paper, now thrived on her office windowsill. Green. Growing. Alive. The cracked mug held pens on her desk, its handle worn smooth from her grip. The photo of her husband sat beside Derek's commissioning picture, not hidden anymore, not carried in secret, but present. Visible. Hers. She'd spent 8 months hiding. 8 months carrying her real identity in a unit patch sewn inside a jacket lining. 8 months as Katie the nurse instead of Captain Morrison, whatever that meant. She was done hiding. The mission didn't fail. It just changed forms. And the nurse who walked toward danger while everyone else ran was still walking that direction, just with her real name on the door now. If you made it this far, you understand that quiet people aren't quiet because they're weak. They're quiet because they've already survived the things that would make most of us scream. Subscribe if you want more stories about people the world underestimated. Like this video. Comment, have you ever misjudged someone and been completely wrong about who they were?